Story 1. I support this for each branch of the federal government. McConnell is 159 years old. Pelosi is 140 years old. So many of them need to retire. Story 2. There is a minimum, so a maximum makes sense. 35 to 70 seems reasonable. A 70-year-old running for election would finish the term at 74, maybe 75 depending on the time of birthday, of course. Just for discussion's sake. Story 3. I think a person should have been elected to at least a statewide office before being able to run for president. Story 4. No, I have met people in their 50s who would be too incapacitated for the job, and yet I have met people in their 90s who would be capable. As long as they are mentally fit, then it is fine. Story 5. I am not sure because I think older presidents are not necessarily the issue. A lot of the time, if they are older, they can be wiser and make good decisions. I think it is more a matter of character judgment. Story 6. Elected officials should be required to retire at the retirement age and take only what they have earned for their voters. Story 7. I am less concerned with age-related impairment than with corruption. There has to be an undoing of citizens united. Foreign governments should not be allowed to influence our elections with their money. Politicians need to be barred from voting on things that affect their investments. If that means they need to have their investments in a trust or have no investments, then we need to do that. After we get rid of all that, then let's worry about some of these older people who are not as lucid. Story 8. I do not mind a man or woman of retirement age being president because I think you should have life experience and wisdom that comes with age. There should be a cutoff age, though. I think it is more important to not have delusional psychopaths at any age. Story 9. Term and age limits. Age should be between 45 and 65. Anyone with parents in their late 60s and older sees the cognitive decline. We may be living longer, but mentally we are not the same. Story 10. Use cognitive tests for meaningful metrics. Do not rely on age simply because older age is correlated. Person A can be sharp at 85, while person B can develop early onset dementia at 63. Story 11. Age is not always about the number. Some people in their 70s are sharper than a new pencil, while others in their 60s feel like they need a nap. It depends more on the energy and ideas they bring than the digits in their age. We need to evaluate them based on their vibe, not just the year on their birth certificate, in my opinion. Story 12. An IQ test as well as a psychological profile. Donnie is a sociopathic narcissist, in my honest opinion. Most people at 65 want to retire, not take on a big job, unless it prevents being sent to jail as a convicted felon. There is no spray tan in jail. Story 13. Absolutely. There is no reason to retire pilots flying commercially and in the military. The president is the commander-in-chief. Story 14. It does not make sense to allow pensioners to hold important positions within the government. Over the age of 70, their faculties and capabilities have significantly declined. How we are allowing them to run the country and perform extremely stressful jobs baffles me. Story 15. Why? Just vote for a younger candidate next time. You are literally advocating for limiting your own democratic choice. Why? Story 16. Barack Obama is close to that age. Even though he is no longer eligible, I would not mind someone like him being president. Story 17. I don't know if age limits are fair. My mother-in-law is 90 years old, and she is sharp as a tack and still in great physical health, believe it or not. Not that she is interested in running for president. However, competency tests may very well be in order. I could certainly support that. Story 18. 75 on Inauguration Day, and I would be okay with it. I think 65 is too young given our current life expectancy. However, I agree that something needs to be done. I would not oppose 70 either if that is what it took to get legislation passed. I do not think they would pass age limits for president. There are too many older people in Congress, and you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of all states to make this happen. Story 19. I fully support capping the voting age at 70, and I am 57. Allowing older people to make decisions and run the country when the future does not belong to them is pathetic and has proven to be a huge mistake. Story 20. I would probably say 65 when their term starts or 70 when it ends. Doing the job right is extremely stressful, and very few older people can sustain that. I would also put caps on Congress, 75 at the end of their term. Story 21. I mean, they have a minimum, so it makes sense to have a maximum. But I would say 70 is probably a more reasonable age. After that, decline really seems to start. Story 22. Yes, I've said this for years, and it is not age discrimination. If you have to be 36 to run for that office, then once you are a certain age, you should no longer be able to run for similar reasons. Story 23. I do not care about a person's physical age. I care about their cognitive ability. I want a standardized cognitive ability test and a Mensa-sponsored intelligence quotient test for every candidate for the Senate and presidency. If a person cannot pass a certain minimum threshold on the standardized cognitive ability test, they should not run for Senate or president. The House of Representatives should have a much lower standard because it is considered the lower house. Story 24. Make cognitive brain function tests mandatory every year. Failure or refusal to take the test should be grounds for immediate impeachment. Story 25. For all politicians, remove these old white males from office. They ruin everything and exploit the rest of us for money and power. Story 26. I absolutely would in a heartbeat. Set it at 65. It is crazy to me that our laws are in the hands of people who make far more money than we will ever see in our lifetime. People who were alive to benefit from Jim Crow. And then we wonder why these people are so out of touch with the modern American. Greed is the root of all evil. Story 27. Age limit, mental cognitive test, constitution test, yes to all the above, including term limits for the Supreme Court. Story 28. Yes. I think the ideal age for the presidency should be 45 to 65. You are old enough to have wisdom and maturity while still young enough to perform your duties without health concerns. The fact that we have people running the country in their 70s and 80s is absolutely insane to me. My job in law enforcement has a mandatory retirement age of 57. Story 29. Why stop at the president? The maximum age should be 65 for any position in government. What business do you have being in charge of the younger generation's futures when you are practically ashes and dust? Story 30. I'll move it to 70 and say yes. As we have seen, anyone over 75 just doesn't have the mental or physical capacity to do the job. We've had presidents over 75, and when they left office, it clearly aged them mentally and physically. The presidency ages those in office. You can see it in the youngest of our modern presidents. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were in their mid-40s when they became president. They both left in their 50s. It aged them both. I think we will reconsider having older presidents. Story 31. I find it shocking how many people in the United States government are over 70, especially at higher levels. I supported Joe Biden for his policies, but not as a person because of his age. He is in his late 70s or early 80s. What is he doing trying to run for president again? There should definitely be an age limit. I would prefer not to have an elderly person running the country. I want someone who is mentally and physically alert and active enough to do the job. 65 is the typical retirement age. That should be the cutoff, or maybe 67 or 68. Although elderly people can be mentally alert, it is clear that cognitive abilities tend to decline at that age. Story 32. Yes, for age limits, 65 seems low, as many people over 65 but under 75 are really lucid and have a wealth of knowledge. Story 33. Not only yes, but they should have served in the military at least once so they understand what they are truly fighting for. Story 34. You can run if you will be 70 by the time the term ends. That works for me. Or frankly, anything tied to a mandatory retirement age or required 401k or Social Security disbursement would work too. Apart from the obvious cognitive decline, I like the idea of past presidents having time to still do good or be an experienced sounding board, like Obama having Carter, the Bushes, and Clinton. There is something reassuring about that. I imagine the next president will commiserate with former presidents. Story 35. No, because it is an artificial limit and someone who is 65 can certainly do the job. However, I would like to see voters seriously consider candidates who are younger than 80 years old. Story 36. 70. And not just the president. Congress and the Supreme Court too. There was a member of Congress who had been placed in memory care but never resigned her term. Cannot remember who it was. Also, there is the Dianne Feinstein situation where her staff did not let her out of the office unattended. It is concerning and needs limitation. Story 37. When you say limiting the age to 65, does that mean you would not be able to run if you turn 65 during the term of office? Story 38. I like the idea of having people in charge who have a vested interest in the future. And look at the mayhem in the American asylum these days. Story 39. I would support an age limit if it came with a cognitive and health test for all candidates. Age alone is not the issue. Mental sharpness and adaptability are. Some 70-year-olds are sharper than 40-year-olds. Story 40. I think the United States has to ask itself, why are United States politicians generally so old? Most of the world does not have maximum age limits either, yet older people in politics are much rarer. Why? Story 41. I would say a maximum of 65 at the moment of the first inauguration. Otherwise, the president could be a maximum of 58 at the first inauguration, so he would probably have to start at 55 with lobbying. You want to have an experienced president, so let's say he would have to be at least a two-term governor or senator. In the end, there is the issue that people in every other branch are too young, so they are not too old to become president. Story 42. Dear God, yes. If there is a minimum age, there should be a maximum age. I am a nurse. Some of the things these politicians are saying would lead to a psychiatric evaluation and diagnosis of dementia, psychosis, delirium, or flight of ideas. I have had patients come in saying things like, I speak to God. I know the will of the Lord. God told me to do this. Or they say wild things about chips in their brains, that certain politicians are controlled by the devil, and that behavior gets them sent to a behavioral hospital. But here we are in the United States with people holding office spouting the same things. Story 43. Maybe not 65, maybe 70. Cabinet members require an IQ test of some sort. How are these clowns in charge of anything? Story 44. If you are talking about the United States president, not allowing an impeached convicted felon to occupy that office should be the first consideration. Age discrimination need not enter the equation. Story 45. No, that is ageist. Most people in their late 60s still have all their faculties. It is on an individual basis. It is about the individual when they run for president. Story 46. No. If people do not feel confident in a candidate, they will not vote for him or her unless they prefer senility to whatever the other options are offering. Story 47. I would say 70 is a better number, but conceptually I agree. There is a 35-year age minimum, which I also agree with, though we should discuss tweaking that number as well. We definitely need career term limits on lower elected offices, like the Senate and the House of Representatives. Story 48. No. The issue is mental decline, not age. Different people experience mental decline at different ages. Some lucky people do not experience it until their 70s and 80s. Let the people decide who is fit to serve by our votes. Story 49. I upset my father-in-law by saying that all elected officials, judges, and appointees should have mandatory retirement at age 65. If we cannot trust an airline pilot after age 65, why trust the same person with running the country, state, county, city, or courtroom? Story 50. 65 seems pretty young for an upper bound, especially if it is a limit at any point and not just on election day. Story 51. The House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the President should all have a maximum age limit of 50. Not because of any issues of mental competency, but because you should be forced to live in the world you helped create after you leave office. Many elderly individuals are willing to pass harmful legislation because they expect to die in the next 3 or 4 years. If it were guaranteed that you would have to endure the consequences of your actions for 20 or 30 years, you might be more likely to pass laws that do not endanger all of us within a decade. Story 52. I have said this many times. The oldest when elected is 62. If they get 2 terms, they would be out by 70. Teachers, air traffic controllers, military personnel, and pilots are just a few professions that have a mandatory retirement age. Story 53. This is arbitrary, just like the minimum age of 35 years or older. It needs to take into account competency, but arguably the primary elections should, in a normal world, resolve this issue. Story 54. No, age equates to experience and knowledge of our complicated system of government. It is not always bad. Taking that away from voters seems arbitrary. Many people remain sharp into very old ages. If the American voters want someone over 65, they should have that right. There is a Elizabeth Warren and Bernard Sanders for every Joseph Biden and Donald Trump. Story 55. No. If someone spent 20 years as a teacher in the military or being a doctor before entering politics and gaining the experience to run, they would probably be in their 60s. We could miss out on a genuinely good candidate who was not a lifelong politician. I would say the oldest I would prefer is voting for a 70-year-old for their re-election as president. I would prefer they be younger, but if they are a good leader, I would not reject them because of their age at that point. However, by 75, they should have no business trying to run the country. Story 56. No. Elderly individuals deserve to participate in democracy as well. Young people are equally capable of incompetence. Story 57. Why stop at the president? Let's set age limits for all elected officials. While we're at it, let's lower that age limit to 50 or 55. Let's elect officials who are in touch with the modern world. Let's also implement term limits for all of them. Story 58. I don't like an age limit approach. It's like saying your age has anything to do with your suitability. That is still young. Anyway, check this out. Three-pronged approach. Competency test by a minimum of 5 independent doctors. Results to be published ahead of the election. Term limit reform. 2 maximum terms allowed for a nominee who gets appointed. There are reforms we can do here to make it more ironclad. Financial fidelity. This is where I want more transparency and accountability, but I am not sure what is legal. Story 59. No, because it is arbitrary. I would be fine requiring an objective cognitive test to be passed with measurable criteria, but if we were going to set an age limit, it would have to be older than 65. Why would we limit a highly qualified, healthy person who is mentally strong from leading the country? I could accept a cap at 80, bar anyone who would turn 80 during their term from being eligible. However, I can think of many other things I would prioritize with a constitutional amendment that would be better than this if I could pass one amendment by choice. Story 60. There should be age limits and competency tests for the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. End lifetime appointments. Elderly individuals who have nothing in common with the world or its constituents have no business ruling the so-called free world. It is an embarrassment. There should be no lobbyists funding candidates, especially the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. We need to start reforming from the bottom to the top and remove the two-party system. That has always been said to be the downfall of our nation. Story 61. That is just trying to achieve through legislation what we have not been able to achieve at the polls. If the country does not want ancient presidents, then why do we keep voting for these individuals? Do not get me wrong, I desperately wish Donald Trump was not our president, but the thing about believing in democracy is you still have to believe in it when the people make an absolutely foolish choice. Story 62. The world leader does not need to be age-limited, but they should be in good physical and mental health. We have seen younger presidents enter office and emerge looking aged. For example, look at Obama. It is not advisable to elect someone who is old and potentially developing Alzheimer's disease. I believe neurological disorders, frequent misspeaking, babbling, loss of recent memory, incoherent speech, inattention, and loss of focus or ideas should disqualify a candidate. These symptoms are generally associated with the elderly population, but being older does not necessarily make someone a bad leader. If the population votes based on wisdom and life experience, that is acceptable. The only requirement is that the leader is in good health. Story 63. Had to have served 2 terms of office as an elected representative, either at the state or federal level, and must be under 65 on the last day of the potential presidency. So really, you could not run for president after you turn 60. That would be my rule if it were up to me. Story 64. Yes, we need younger presidents. I would even support lowering the minimum age to 25. Older people are often out of touch with reality. Story 65. No, because we still choose who goes up. We select our party's nominee. If we want someone younger, we could already be doing that. So why ban something we could simply choose not to support? That is my opinion personally. If anything, lower the minimum age. Story 66. Absolutely. I also think there should be experience qualifications such as military service, political office like governor, mayor, senator, representative, prosecutor, or judge. Some random person should not be president. Story 67. I would require retirement of all government employees at age 71 or age 76. I think age 65 is too soon since many people enter politics in their 50s and are still capable of contributing into their early 70s. Story 68. I would limit it to 60 or 55. Lower the minimum to 30. Alternatively, remove all politicians permanently. That would be best. Story 69. No. A psychological evaluation for all candidates, including a memory test covering 6 months and a reading and writing assessment. Story 70. If you want that, you have the opportunity to impose it. The opportunity arises every 4 years in November. Story 71. Instead of a specific age, I would prefer it to be tied to the life expectancy from the most recent census, so it can adjust with demographic changes. Story 72. In any case, a bad system will result in ineffective politicians. I believe that the law that would most effectively transform our entire political system is ranked choice voting. Story 73. Wholeheartedly support. As a 65-year-old, I have seen far too many presidents whose experience is all about fighting the last war or whether there is a new episode of Gunsmoke on Friday night. As we have seen, age does not necessarily translate into wisdom or good common sense. Story 74. That will not solve the problem. Removing money from politics is the better solution. Citizens United needs to be eliminated. Story 75. I would do a physical test. If they are physically fit, it is most likely they will be mentally fit as well. Additionally, the president should be ready for anything. Story 76. Absolutely. That should apply to Congress and the Senate as well. No running for office if you will be 70 before the end of your expected term. Senators have 6-year terms and cannot be older than 64 at the start of the term. Members of Congress cannot be older than 68, and the president cannot be older than 62 unless they only want one term, then 66. Story 77. 65 might be too arbitrary. I would prefer it to be based on something more definitive about the average age of cognitive decline. However, a limit on age for entering office could generally be a good thing. Story 78. No. There are plenty of very qualified, very intelligent people older than 65 who also have great experience, hard-earned wisdom, good temperament, and more. I am open to more stringent cognitive testing and similar measures, but not an upper age limit, especially not one that young. 65 is not as old as people think, especially as technology and medicine improve and people live longer. For ages over 65, more towards 75 or 80, I would prefer to rely on stringent testing to disqualify rather than on age alone. Story 79. I would limit it to 58. Given that the youngest you can be eligible for the presidency is 23 years, as long as you turn 58 after the election, should be more than reasonable. You will be done completely at age 62 regardless of whether you met the term limit stipulations or not. This also keeps retirement-eligible individuals out of the presidency. Story 80. Absolutely. You should have to live to see the ramifications of the legislation you push. I am sick of octogenarians. Story 81. Make it 45 on election day and you have to pass a series of exams on history, constitutional law, English literature, and take lessons dodging Central Intelligence Agency bullets. Story 82. Maximum 65. Why do we keep electing out-of-touch people? 65 is a normal retirement age, and these individuals want to run the United States government. Get out of here. Story 83. 65 seems a bit young. Many politicians do not enter politics until after a successful career in another field. Adding that to the years needed to gain enough political experience to run for president, I am not sure that is enough time to provide adequate government experience. Story 84. Absolutely. Geriatric baby boomers have no idea of the needs of the modern age and will not adjust their mindset or agenda to better serve the people, apart from the usual self-serving behavior common among politicians. Story 85. I am fine with whatever the retirement age is in the private sector. I am strongly opposed to party dumping at any age. Kentucky law states that a Republican would replace McConnell if he vacates his Senate seat. Story 86. Age is only one determining factor among several that should be considered before anyone is eligible to run for this office. In most people, physical stamina begins to decline once they reach middle age, generally around 50. Since the engine that drives the thinking process is the brain, and it depends heavily on the person's level of fitness, the two march hand in hand into old age and creeping senility. Exceptions abound, no doubt, but they are likely bright enough not to run for president. Perhaps you remember when you studied hard while in school for an extended period and finished very tired. That is because the brain demands about 20% of the oxygen in the body. Some sort of independently administered test of a candidate's cognitive abilities and grasp of current events should be considered as well. What a candidate says is not always what he does, so stump speeches and empty promises do not count. Most politicians are skillful at distorting the truth. For example, if Donald Trump told me that the sun is shining, I would look out the window. Aside from all that, I tend to favor a reasonable age limit. All of this is academic, since no well-qualified candidate is likely to present himself unless he is bought and paid for at the outset. Honest men rarely become politicians, and those elected come with more strings than a carnival marionette. Story 87. Not a good idea. Life is short enough for gaining experience. If you want to be the best at something, they are going to be old. Story 88. Yes, definitely. People above that age are at high risk for mental and physical decline and are less likely to understand the intricacies of modern society. 65 years ago is already 1960. Retirement age is in the early 60s for a reason. People saying 65 is too young and calling for 75 don't realize that 8 years after that is 83. I also think the lower limit should be dropped to 30. That way, people under 45 actually have a chance. Only two have ever won: Theodore Roosevelt, age 42, and John F. Kennedy, age 43. Story 89. Yes, I would. The presidency is the most stressful job on the planet. Decisions are made that affect the lives of potentially millions or even billions of people. It is no secret that as we age, our thinking processes slow down. In any other job, this is not as critical a factor. There is one other issue I would like to point out. The older a president is, the less they can relate to what life is like, the problems and struggles facing younger generations. The job market today is very different from when I was in my 20s. The cost of living is completely different. A president at 70 or 80 years old is going to have a difficult time grasping that. Story 90. The problem is that too many people in positions of power and responsibility are psychopaths or sociopaths. If they behave without empathy, they should be disqualified from any administrative office and from holding any other type of power over people, regardless of their age or the type of work they do. Story 91. If you completed mandatory mental and physical wellness assessments and are under 65, 90% of elected officials would not qualify. Story 92. Yes, there is a minimum. Why not a maximum? I would also prefer all politicians to have age limits if we cannot have term limits. Story 93. We need age limits on all positions in government: judges, senators, members of Congress, and presidents. At a certain point, individuals become too out of touch. Story 94. 65 is the traditional age to retire. Why are we not treating 78-year-old presidents like our kindly old defenseless grandpa? Story 95. Very much yes. All elected positions, including federal and state, should be included. Also, I would forbid political parties from selecting, sponsoring, funding, recommending, or endorsing candidates for president or vice president. Every election should be a nationwide primary in which everyone who can vote gets to participate. Then, I would set strict spending limits on presidential campaigns. There would be a budget for television, radio, internet, and grassroots promotion, but no robocalls. Those must end. Candidates may raise more funds than they are allowed to spend. Winning candidates must donate any remaining funds to the federal government pursuant to the transition of power and their agenda, tax deductible. Losing candidates could keep any remaining funds for their next attempt or return them to their backers as best they can. Next, I will have the presidential campaign season formalized. This will last a number of weeks before Election Day, no more than 2 months. Finally, Election Day must be a national holiday. All eligible voters must be allowed time off to vote. During the week prior, 24-hour registration will be open to anyone who is not yet registered and has proof of citizenship. Voting itself should be done by means of an app using biometrics and government-issued identification for security. Counting will be done by a machine running fully open-source software. Story 96. Air traffic control has mandatory retirement at age 54. I would support something similar for the president. Story 97. I think we should have age limits and a maximum number of years in public office. As others have noted, Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi have been in office since about the beginning of the Civil War. I would support a system similar to 3 strikes and you are out with enforced rules for politicians. Practices like insider trading should be prohibited and carry penalties. Story 98. 70. There are very good 62-year-olds, and they should be able to serve 2 terms. Over 70 is too far. But really, we should not need this. The electorate decides. Let us just do better. Story 99. No, I would not. Several of our great presidents were older. I do believe all of them should open their tax returns and have a physical that includes cognitive functioning when they announce their intention to run. It is obvious Donald Trump has had cognitive issues for the last decade, and Joe Biden has had similar issues for the last 2 years. But in many ways, John F. Kennedy also had cognitive challenges, and he was very young. He was taking medications that should have been disclosed. Franklin D. Roosevelt was dying when he was elected for the 4th time. However, there was no one who could have taken over at that time. Harry S. Truman did not even know about the atomic bomb, which was inexcusable. Currently, Vladimir Putin knows more of our secrets than J.D. Vance does. That physical and cognitive exam should be identical for all candidates, and they should agree to take it. Ronald Reagan certainly should have had a cognitive exam. He was far worse cognitively than we knew. For those who are not yet older, ages 65 to 70 are among the most productive years for many. After 70, it becomes harder to have a demanding job. I am getting close to 80. I read 350 pages a day between 6 a.m. and noon. I have written research papers in the last 5 years, presented them, and cognitively I am doing great. However, fatigue from research and writing is real. It never was until I turned 75. I am sure there are those who can keep doing complex thinking until later, but the fatigue is real. Story 100. Maybe. I need to think about it more. I would require candidates to be 65 years old or younger to run, but they can exceed that age during their term. They might even be allowed to run for re-election for a successive term, even if they are over 65. I believe we are experiencing a unique moment in history where one of the largest generations is also one of the longest lived due to advancements in healthcare. This has enabled them to retain power longer than previous generations. As they move on, we should return to a more normal pattern of passing the baton at a younger average age. Still, it may be useful to establish guardrails for this convergence of events. Story 101. The age limit set for the Indian National Congress would prevent it from becoming a family business, which it has become. Story 102. It should be lower than that. I know mental decline can happen much earlier, but if you can be president until age 35, then 50 to 55 should be the maximum age. Story 103. Many government jobs already have age limits. If the job has a minimum age, it should have a maximum age too. 65 is a good number. Story 104. No, because in the future they would likely have to change it. However, I agree that independent cognitive tests should be conducted. Story 105. No. If younger people want to become president, they should beat older people in elections. If they cannot do this, that is their problem. Story 106. No, because it is based on ageism and ableism and does not address the actual problems with our government at all. Story 107. Age limit of 60 at the start of the term for all elected offices. Supreme Court appointments should last for life, but members should be required to retire at 65. We should not have people making decisions that will affect the next several decades when there is a good possibility they will not even finish the next decade. Story 108. Until we get rid of Citizens United, the worst Supreme Court decision since Dred Scott, we will be living under the rule of billionaires. Presently, they are behind the destruction of democracy and have the money to influence an entire generation. Story 109. I do not know. I feel like that is setting up the future to create someone who would be great, but not electable. Story 110. If there is a minimum age to run for the office, then there should also be a maximum age requirement. A retirement age and no lifetime terms should be implemented. Story 111. That is a tricky question that I think about often. On one hand, I understand the appeal of wanting someone sharp, energetic, and ready to handle the fast pace of the job. There is a clear argument for choosing a leader in their prime who is not struggling with physical or mental challenges. However, I also consider the wisdom, experience, and historical perspective that come with age. Some of the most insightful leaders were well past 65 when they made significant impacts. It seems like excluding older candidates would mean losing valuable life lessons and insights. Additionally, age is not a perfect measure of competence or energy. Some 70-year-olds have more vitality than some 40-year-olds. Personally, I do not support a strict age limit. I believe it is more important to consider the individual's capacity, health, and mental sharpness, which vary greatly at any age. It is less about the age on the birth certificate and more about what is in the mind and heart. Story 112. Yes, age is necessary for experience to act. Youth, relatively speaking, is necessary to act appropriately to the current generation. Story 113. I would say 35 to 65 is a solid range for any politician. You gain life experience, have a potential 30-year career, and will not be making laws for people who will be adults long after you are gone. Story 114. I would be good with 70 for all of them. The President, Congress, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. Term limits would also be good. Story 115. I would set it at 65 for all elected officials, to be honest. We need a system that allows generational turnover to happen naturally. The baby boomers have taught us that with modern medicine and access to high-level healthcare, they can hold on to their positions indefinitely. So much so that generations are being skipped in regard to political power. Story 116, maybe not that young. There are some cognitive people who are much older, and younger people who are not there at all. 75 would be fine. Possibly an application to extend your time if you continue in the political field. It should be strict. No easy questions, no rigging. Otherwise, we get people like Donald Trump, Ronald Reagan, and Joe Biden in. Story 117, yes, absolutely. 35 to 65 is a fine age range. Old enough to have some life experience and education, with a general grasp of the concerns of the general population. Young enough to not be out of touch and cognitive decline is less likely. Story 118, no. Biden was quite old for the office, but he was the only one who could unite the left to defeat Donald Trump. He was the only candidate with enough experience to appease the nominee needs experience crowd and the various other groups in the left wing. Setting an age limit would risk having another authoritarian lunatic elected if the Democrats cannot unite around a younger and less experienced nominee. He also helped save us from COVID-19. Story 119. I think an age of 75 in good health would be a good place to set a limit. You can serve until 75, but you cannot serve a second term after that. So, the latest a newcomer might try would be 70 to 75 years. I believe term limits for Congress are a far bigger issue and would help the country more. Hopefully, President Biden's current state is an anomaly rather than the norm. Story 120. I would not be opposed to it. But with the limit being 65, do you mean they cannot be any older than 65 at the start of their term? Or the end of it? For example, can they turn 66 while already president? Story 121. Would not support because it would make it easier and more acceptable to discriminate against individuals over 65 who need or want to work. Story 122. If there is a retirement age for other jobs, why not for the highest office in the country? The same applies to all politicians. Story 123. No, that is literally grandpa's. Yes, I know that our current president is a grandpa and so was the one before that, but that is beside the point. Story 124. I don't think I would support an age limit for president. I wouldn't vehemently oppose it either. 65 still seems somewhat reasonable. However, I would set a maximum length of service for all major federal positions, including president, House representative, senator, and Supreme Court justice. It doesn't have to be small. You don't need to be a senator for more than 20 years. Let someone else do the work. Similarly, setting a limit of 20 years for the Supreme Court does not seem unreasonable. It is long enough to remain politically independent. But the time limit prevents people from clinging to the position far beyond what makes sense. Story 125. Yes. I was surprised to find out that my company required anyone in management aged 65 or older to retire or move to a worker position. However, the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. We all decline with age. It is not as if we remain just as mentally sharp as we were at 25 and then suddenly become old at 73. In fact, scientific discoveries mostly occur when people are under 40, not over it. Albert Einstein first published something about the theory of relativity when he was 26. He received the Nobel Prize for it at the age of 42. I do not think he produced anything of that significance during the remaining 34 years of his life. In fact, I do not see any other scientific publications from him after age 40. Story 126. No, 65 is too young. You would be eliminating a lot of expertise and wisdom. As a point of reference, several European countries have an age limit of 75 for judges. That might be a better option. Story 127. No. The responsibilities of the presidency require maturity, wisdom, and strong management skills. These take years of experience to develop. I would support limiting regular people from becoming president without first engaging in politics through an elected role as governor or in the United States Congress. Allowing an unqualified individual to lead the country is a bad idea. Story 128. No, 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 no. And I mean absolutely not. First off, the retirement age is 67. Why should the retirement age for president be 65? Shouldn't it match? The president already has an age limit. It's called elections. Don't want an old person as president? Don't vote for them. What did you think voting for a man in 1946 would result in? Youth? Why are we only limiting the president? Why not the vice president? Why not all members of Congress? What happens when a candidate turns 65 during their term? Do you expect them to resign? What happens when the president is 64 years and 363 days old on the day they're sworn in? Do they quit 3 days later? And then what? What happens if the vice president is over 65? Do we just keep going down the line of succession? What happens if a person who is 61 runs for president? Are they not allowed to run for another term? And most importantly, and I will say this very clearly since many don't seem to understand, just because someone is old doesn't mean they're bad. Just because someone is old doesn't mean they're bad. Just because someone is old doesn't mean they're bad. Shouldn't experience and competence be the determining factors for voting for someone? For example, Marjorie Taylor Greene is young, but I bet many would vote for Joe Biden over her. Yet some claim they don't want old people in office, but would vote for Biden over her. What if Kamala Harris had won last year? Harris is 61. What would happen when she turns 65 if she had won? Would she have to stop being president? What if someone younger ran against her? Again, shouldn't experience, competence, and policy make a good president, not obsessing over their age. Story 129. We do not allow people to fly commercial planes after they turn 65. Why are we allowing politicians over 65 to lead our country into decline? Story 130. Yes. Along with a cognitive test done by at least 3 different doctors from 3 of the top institutions. Story 131. I don't have a particular objection to the idea, but I think it is just a band-aid. Setting an age limit will not change the type of people who run for office. It just makes them younger. I would much rather see age limits imposed by voters making better choices. We have extremely low turnout in primary elections. I think voters could impose these limits if turnout were closer to general election levels. Setting an age cap would require a constitutional amendment, which is unlikely to happen. So we either keep complaining while nothing changes, or get people to show up to vote and force change to happen. Story 132. No, 65 sounds old, but when I get to that age, I'm going to think it's not old. It has happened at every stage in life so far. I thought 20 was old when I was 10, but then I turned 20, and I thought 30 was old. Guess what? I turned 30 and realized I was wrong again. If someone wants to work until they're 75, good for them. I think a standardized cognitive test at a certain age for presidency would be fine if there's a candidate over a certain age. A non-politicized one that is the same for both parties, and the results must be shown to the American public as soon as the tests are done. Also, term limits. Nobody should be allowed to be a career politician. I feel like that comes with serious corruption in both parties. I think if we had a standardized cognitive test for the last election, Joseph Biden would never have won the primaries, been forced to step down by his own party, Kamala Harris being undemocratically selected as the Democratic Party's presidential candidate, and Donald Trump wouldn't have won. I voted for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in the primaries. I thought he was the best candidate to run for office. He was more neutral as a president, which I thought we needed. As an independent voter, what swayed me away from voting in this past election was the fact that the news outlets and Democratic politicians praised Joseph Biden as a sharp candidate, yet he had his word salads on a live debate table. The icing on the cake was the Democratic Party picking a candidate for the American people who didn't receive any electoral votes. That was not democracy, and I was not going to support it. If they had held an emergency election to pick a new Democratic nominee for president, I might have voted for the Democratic Party in the last election, and I strongly think the Democratic Party would be in office right now. Story 133. Being under 65 when starting a term should be straightforward. If you were under 65 when starting your first term and are pursuing a second consecutive term, that should be acceptable. Story 134. I would support requiring a candidate to be 70 or 75 years old by Inauguration Day, or something similar. 65 is a bit young in my opinion, but not by much. Story 135. I'm for it, but as a caveat, I think after age 65 the president should be able to run again provided they go through a Logan's Run style carousel renewal to qualify. Yes, absolutely, the actual Logan's Run computer should be in charge of that renewal ceremony. Story 136. You should not be able to run for or be appointed to an office if you will be over 64 years old on the day you were sworn in. Story 137. I think the United States always emphasizes that people have the right to vote and make themselves heard. Putting an age restriction seems like taking away people's rights. Voters should think more about who they vote for. Does this 20-year-old have enough knowledge, or is this 80-year-old, who may be approaching the end of life, really going to care about the impact of their decisions in the future? Story 138. I would need to sort out details, but absolutely support the idea. 65 on election day seems about right, maybe even younger. 65 halfway through the first term, so 63 around election day. Supreme Court for sure, and that one does not need a lower barrier. Many other positions have mandatory retirement ages. Why not these? Story 139. I would not. What I would support is mental acuity testing more along the lines of a live, not written, political and diplomatic scholastic assessment test to be administered to all federal political candidates, with their results published before primary elections. That way, we would avoid the chance of another Trump or Biden, and also avoid the likes of Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and John Kennedy of Louisiana. I dare say there are more than a few others on both sides of the aisle who would find themselves looking for a job if they were forced to prove that they know what they are doing and how to get it done. Story 140. I would say a politician cannot be elected into office if their age exceeds 80% of last year's median age of death in the United States. This will incentivize many positive behaviors that benefit the public. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.